Wind screamed across the alkali flats, scouring the lone cabin crouched beneath the bloodroot peaks. Inside, Miriam Vance traced the dust on her empty table, the silence a tombstone for 20 years. Then, a hesitant knock shattered the stillness. Opening the warped door revealed not a neighbor, but 15 pairs of desperate eyes staring up from the twilight. Small bodies shivering in rags against the desert's dying breath. Her solitude ended with a whisper of fear and the raw scent of unwashed children. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I got something extra special saved just for you. The desert didn't forgive. Miriam Vance knew this truth, like she knew the ache in her knuckles after hauling water from the bitter spring half a mile east. It was etched into cracked mud bricks of her cabin, bleached into the bones of the Ocotillo skeleton guarding her door, and woven into the relentless, grit-laden wind that howled down from the bloodroot peaks. For 2 decades, the desert had been her only companion, a harsh mistress replacing the warmth of a husband lost to a mine collapse and the phantom cries of children her womb had refused to bear. Her world was a study in muted tones, the dun-colored scrub stretching to a horizon blurred by heat haze, the faded gray planks of the cabin walls, the perpetual film of dust on every surface inside. The only splash of defiance was her struggling garden plot, a patch of stubborn green fenced with gnarled mesquite branches. Even that felt like a taunt some days. Today was one of those days. Kneeling in the parched earth, Miriam yanked at a spindly weed. The stem snapped, sending a puff of fine soil into the air. It settled on her worn calico skirt. Another layer of futility. 20 years. 20 years of hauling water, patching leaks, watching horizons empty of anything but hawks and dust devils. The town of Dry Springs lay 10 miles south, a cluster of bleachwood buildings she visited only for absolute necessity. Salt, lead, the rare piece of news that never concerned her. Their pitying glances, the way conversations hushed when she approached. It was easier to stay away, easier to wrestle the silence than the ghosts of what might have been. She stood, wiping her hands on her skirt, leaving smudges on the faded blue fabric. The ache wasn't just in her knuckles. It was a hollow pressure behind her ribs, a familiar companion. She walked back to the cabin, her boots crunching on the gravelly earth. Inside, the familiar gloom embraced her. The single room held a cot, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a coal hearth, and shelves holding meager supplies. Her husband Silas's old harmonica sat on the mantel, untouched for years, a relic under dust. The silence pressed in, heavier than the desert heat. It wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. This is all, it seemed to whisper. This empty room, this failing garden, this endless wind. This is your legacy. She gripped the edge of the table, the rough wood biting into her palm. A wave of profound emptiness, sharper than grief, colder than loneliness, washed over her. What was the point of the hauling, the tending, the enduring? For whom? The answer, as always, was the wind whistling through a crack in the doorframe. Then the knock came, not the firm rap of a neighbor, nor the impatient thud of a rare peddler. It was hesitant, almost furtive, a scrabbling sound like small, uncertain knuckles against the sun-bleached wood. Miriam froze, her breath catching. No one came here. Ever. The knock came again, slightly louder this time, accompanied by a muffled whimper from outside. Heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm long forgotten, Miriam moved to the door. Her hand hovered over the latch, calloused and trembling slightly. The rational part of her screamed caution. Bandits used tricks. Desperate men did worse. She lifted the heavy iron bar and pulled the door open just a crack, squinting against the late afternoon glare. It wasn't bandits. It wasn't even one person. It was children. A sea of ragged, dirty faces filled the narrow view from the doorway, spilling down the single step onto the hard-packed earth of her yard. Big eyes, wide with exhaustion and fear, stared up at her from faces smudged with dirt and what looked like soot. They were all sizes, a couple of toddlers clinging to the legs of older ones barely into their teens, and every age in between. 15 pairs of eyes, Miriam counted automatically, a cold dread replacing the emptiness. Their clothes were torn, patched with mismatched fabrics, stained with travel and neglect. They carried nothing but the dust on their boots and the desperation in their posture. The oldest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 14, stood slightly in front, her thin shoulders squared with burden far too heavy. Her dark hair was matted, her cheeks hollow. Behind her, a boy of about 10 held a smaller girl, maybe 3, whose thumb was firmly in her mouth, her eyes huge and unblinking. Miriam's throat closed. She gripped the doorframe. What you want? Her voice came out a rasp, and used to addressing anyone, let alone a small army of the wretched. The oldest girl swallowed hard. Please, ma'am. Her voice was thin, scraped raw. Just shelter. For the night. We won't be no trouble. She gestured weakly behind her at the huddled mass. We come from the east. There was trouble. Miriam's gaze swept over them. Trouble that was written plain as day on their gaunt faces, in the way a boy near the back kept glancing fearfully over his shoulder towards the empty scrubland, in the dark smudges under the eyes of the older children. They looked like scarecrows blown in by the wind, ready to collapse. Her instinct screamed to shut the door, bar it fast, retreat into her manageable solitude. This was chaos. This was hunger and noise and demands she couldn't possibly meet. Her meager stores, her tiny space, her fragile peace. It would all be shattered. She started to shake her head, the refusal forming on her lips. I ain't got. She began. The little girl in the boy's arms pulled her thumb from her mouth. Her lower lip trembled violently. She stretched out a tiny, grubby hand toward Miriam, not reaching for anything specific, just a gesture of pure, silent supplication. Her eyes, enormous and blue-gray like storm clouds, locked onto Miriam's. No words, just a mute, heartbreaking plea. Miriam Vance felt something crack deep inside her, a fissure opening in the ice of 20 years. That small, outstretched hand was a hook snagging on a memory she'd buried long ago, the memory of wanting to hold a child just like that, of yearning for that simple, profound connection. Lord have mercy, she breathed, the words escaping before she could stop them. The refusal died unspoken. Her hand, still on the door, pushed it open wider. Get in, she said, her voice rough but unmistakable. All of you, getting out of that wind. A collective sigh, almost a whimper of relief, went through the group. They shuffled forward, a wave of small, exhausted bodies pressing past her into the dimness of the cabin. The smell hit her immediately. Unwashed skin, sweat, fear in the dry, mineral scent of the desert they traversed. They filled the small space instantly, huddling together near the cold hearth like chicks seeking warmth, their eyes wide as they took in the sparse surroundings. The littlest ones simply sank to the floor where they stood. Miriam closed the door, the solid thud echoing in the suddenly crowded room. The silence was gone, replaced by the soft shuffling of feet, muffled coughs, and the ragged breathing of children pushed beyond their limits. Her sanctuary was invaded. Panic fluttered in her chest. What had she done? 15 mouths, 15 bodies. She had half a sack of cornmeal, a few strips of jerky, a small crock of rendered fat, and some dried beans. Water was precious. Right, she said, forcing authority into her voice, trying to mask the tremor. Settle down. Don't touch nothing. You! She pointed to the oldest girl. What's your name? Lena, ma'am, the girl answered, pulling a toddler closer to her side. Lena, see that bucket by the door? Take it. There's a spring east. Follow the path past the garden. Fill it. Don't dawdle. Lena nodded, her expression serious, and grabbed the bucket, ushering a boy of about 8 to help her. Miriam turned to the others. The rest of you sit. Floor is clean enough. She moved her shelves, her mind racing. Blankets. She had 2 thin quilts and an old horse blanket. She pulled them down. "You!" She pointed to a sturdy-looking boy of 12. "Take these. Shed them out best you can." He scrambled up, taking the bundle with surprising care. Food. She scooped cornmeal into her largest pot, added water from her small reserve jug, and stirred. It would be thin gruel, barely enough. She broke the jerky into tiny pieces, adding them for what little protein they offered. The beans would have to wait. They took hours. As she worked, stirring the pot over the small fire she coaxed to life on the hearth, she stole glances at the children. They were eerily quiet, watching her every move with unnerving intensity. No bickering, no playful shoving, just a watchful exhaustion. Some bore fading bruises, a yellowing mark on a boy's forearm, a scrape on Lena's cheekbone. Their clothes, now visible in the firelight, weren't just worn. Some bore rips that looked suspiciously deliberate, not just from wear and tear. The boy who'd been glancing outside earlier, Jed, another boy had called him, was kneeling near the door. He wasn't sitting. He was carefully smoothing a patch of hard-packed earth on her floor with his palm. Miriam frowned. "What are you doing, boy?" He flinched, looking up guiltily. "Nothing, ma'am. Just smoothing," but his eyes darted nervously to the door. Lena returned with the water bucket, panting slightly. "He's looking for tracks, ma'am," she said softly, setting the bucket down. "Old habit. Tracks." Miriam asked, her spoon pausing in the gruel. "Whose tracks?" Lena exchanged a look with Jed, a silent communication passing between them. Jed quickly stood up, wiping his hand on his pants. "Just animals, ma'am. Rabbits. Sometimes coyotes come close at night." His voice was too quick, too high. Lena busied herself helping Miriam pour water into cups made from tin cans for the smallest children. Miriam's unease deepened. They were scared. Not just tired, not just hungry, scared of something specific, something that followed. She stirred the gruel, the simple task suddenly feeling monumental, the weight of 15 fragile lives pressing on her, heavier than the desert silence ever had. She'd opened the door. Now what? The gruel began to bubble, a weak, starchy smell filling the cabin. The children watched the pot, a collective hunger radiating from them. The muffled thudding stopped. Not faded, not veered off. Stopped right outside the thin plank walls of Miriam Vance's cabin. The silence that followed was thicker than the dust motes dancing in the weak firelight, charged with the hell breath of 15 children, and one woman whose heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Jed's face was parchment pale. Lena had subtly shifted, positioning her thin body slightly in front of the toddler clinging to her skirt. The only sound was the frantic crackle of the small fire under the gruel pot and the ragged, shallow breathing of the smaller children. A heavy fist pounded on the door, sharp and demanding. Not a knock, a command. Miriam met Lena's wide, terrified eyes. A silent understanding passed between them, a pact forged in the span of a heartbeat. Say nothing. Miriam gave the barest nod. She smoothed her worn skirt, a futile gesture against the chaos within, and walked to the door, her spine rigid. The harmonica on the mantel seemed to gleam dully in the gloom, a silent witness. She lifted the heavy bar, her movements deliberate, and pulled the door open just wide enough to see out, blocking the view inside with her body. 3 men stood in the fading twilight, backlit by the bruised purple sky over the bloodroots. Dust coated their boots and trousers up to the knee. The lead rider was Harlan Briggs, who ran the double-bar spread 10 miles north. His face, whether like old saddle leather, was impassive beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Beside him sat Deputy Clyde Barnes from Dry Springs, his narrow eyes sharp and scanning, his hand resting casually near the butt of his coat. The third man Miriam didn't recognize, lean, with a restless energy and eyes that darted over the cabin and yard like a hunting hawk. A drifter, or worse. "Miss Vance," Briggs greeted, his voice a low rumble. He touched the brim of his hat. Unusual to see smoke from your chimney this late. Everything all right? Miriam kept her face carefully neutral, the mask she perfected over 20 solitary years. Manageable, Harlan, just stirring some supper. She kept her body firmly in the doorway. Deputy Barnes leaned forward in his saddle. Passing through on patrol, Ms. Vance heard some commotion earlier. Saw dust kicked up heading this way. Didn't look like usual desert traffic. You seen anyone? Strangers. The drifter's gaze lingered on the ground near the step, where 15 pairs of small feet had scuffed the earth only minutes before. Miriam's pulse quickened. Desert plays tricks, she said flatly. Wind kicks up dust devils bigger and a man some days. Ain't seen no strangers. It wasn't entirely a lie. They weren't strangers anymore. They were a crushing responsibility huddled behind her. The drifter spoke for the first time, his voice a rasp like sandpaper. Ground's pretty tore up for just wind, ma'am. Looks like a whole mess of little feet been through here. Recently. He nudged his horse a step closer, his eyes trying to peer past her shoulder into the dim interior. You sure you're alone? A cold anger, sharp and unexpected, flared in Miriam's chest. It wasn't just protectiveness. It was a violation of her hard-won isolation, the implication she couldn't be trusted. My yard, my business, she stated, her voice hardening. And what I do in my own home is likewise. I told you, I ain't seen no strangers. Now, if you're done disturbing my supper, she made to close the door. Hold on, Miss Vance, Deputy Barnes interjected, holding up a placating hand, though his eyes remained sharp. Just being cautious. There's been trouble. Over near Coyote, Washington camp, got hit hard a couple days back. Bad business. Folks missing. Trail led kind of general this direction. We're just check-in. Coyote, Washington. The name meant nothing to Miriam, but she felt a collective flinch from the children behind her, a subtle rustle of fear. Lena's breath hitched audibly. Jed made a small, choke sound. Ain't seen no trouble, Miriam repeated, gripping the doorframe until her knuckles whitened. Just the usual desert. And I'd appreciate you moving on. My fire's burning low. She infused the words with finality, the unspoken threat a woman pushed to her limit in her own domain. Harlan Briggs studied her face for a long moment. He knew her reputation, the barren widow who kept to herself, brittle as old bone. He also knew she wasn't one to be pushed lightly. He sighed, a puff of dust in the cooling air. All right, Ms. Vance, we'll move on. You see anything unusual, you send word to Dry Springs. Deputy's right. It was bad business over at the Washington. He touched his hat brim again. Evening, Deputy Barnes looked like he wanted to argue, his gaze lingering on the disturbed earth. But a glance from Briggs silenced him. The drifter, however, didn't move. His hawk-like eyes swept over the cabin once more, lingering on the shuttered window. He offered Miriam a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. Real isolated out here, ma'am. Dangerous for a woman alone. You be careful now. Real careful. He nudged his horse, finally turned to follow the others as they walked their mounts back towards the main trail, disappearing into deepening dusk. Miriam slammed the bar back into place with more force than necessary, leaning her forehead against the cool, rough wood. The silence inside was absolute now, heavy with unspoken terror. She turned slowly. 15 pairs of eyes stared back, wide with fear that went deeper than hunger or cold. It was a fear of something hunted. Coyote Wash, Miriam stated, her voice low in the sudden quiet. That means something to you all? Lena swallowed, her thin shoulders slumping. She looked ancient in the firelight. That's where we was, she whispered. Before what? Miriam pressed, moving back to the gruel pot, needing something to do with her hands. She started ladling the thin mixture into the tin cups, her movements jerky. Jed spoke up, his voice tight. Before they came. In the night, men like shadows, with He trailed off, looking at the littlest ones, then back at Miriam, his eyes pleading not to say more. "They burned it," Lena finished, her voice hollow. "The camp took some, hurt others. We ran, just ran, through the dark. The littles we carry 'em." She gestured vaguely eastward, toward the imposing darkness of the Bloodroots. "Been walking days, hid when we heard horses." She looked directly at Miriam, her gaze fierce despite the exhaustion. The man with the deputy. He looked like one of M, not the same, but like M. Miriam handed a cup of gruel to the wide-eyed toddler Lena held. The child took it with trembling hands, not drinking, just clutching it for warmth. Like M, the drifter's unnerving gaze, his insinuating tone, the deliberate way he'd studied her yard, it hadn't been idle curiosity. He'd been looking for signs. Hunting. Her unease solidified into a cold dread that settled in her gut, heavier than stone. This wasn't just trouble. It was a predator on their trail, and she'd open her door to prey. The children ate in near silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons and soft gulps. The gruel was gone in minutes. Miriam distributed the thin blankets. The horse blanket laid on the packed earth floor for the smallest ones to huddle on. She moved Silas's harmonica from the mantel, tucking it into a drawer, an instinctive shielding of the past. As exhaustion finally overcame fear, the children began to curl up, little bodies pressing together for warmth and comfort. The cabin filled with the soft, uneven sounds of sleep. Sighs, whimpers, the congested breathing of a child with a cold. Miriam couldn't sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, the weight of their collective fear of physical pressure. Lena sat nearby, ostensibly watching the little ones. But Miriam saw the tension in her posture, the way her eyes kept flicking to the shuttered window. "Lena," Miriam said softly, not looking at the girl. "What were they after?" "At Coyote Wash." Lena was silent for so long Miriam thought she wouldn't answer. Then, her voice barely a whisper, "Us, the older ones, for work. The littles, they didn't care about the littles." She shuddered. "They had a mark, burned on a post near the big wagon. A C with a snake curled through it, like a brand." Miriam stored the image away. A C with a snake, a brand of slavers, bounty hunters, something vile operating in the shadow of the mountains. It explained the bruises, the ripped clothes, the hunted look. It explained the drifter's predatory interest. He wasn't just like them. He was them, or worked for them. Scouting. The night deepened. The wind picked up again, moaning around the eaves, finding every crack to whistle through. Miriam banked the fire, leaving only glowing coals. She checked the door bar again. Solid. She looked at the sea of sleeping children, their faces softened by slumber, looking heartbreakingly young and vulnerable. The hollow ache behind her ribs, the one that had been her constant companion for 20 years, throbbed differently now. It wasn't just emptiness anymore. It was filled with a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. They were Silas's absence made flesh, the family she'd never had, delivered in rags and terror to her doorstep. She couldn't turn them out. She wouldn't. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the shutters, Miriam rose stiffly. They needed water. She needed to think. She moved quietly, picking up the water bucket. Jed, sleeping near the door, stirred as she lifted the bar. His eyes flew open, instantly alert. "Just getting water, Jed," she murmured. "Keep watch inside." He nodded, scrambling to sit up, his gaze fixed on the door as she slipped out. The morning air was crisp, biting. The alkali flats stretched vast and empty under a pale sky. The bloodroots loomed, jagged and dark. Miriam walked a familiar path toward the spring, the bucket swinging at her side. Her mind raced. Dry Springs was no refuge. The deputy had been suspicious, and word traveled fast. The drifter knew where they were. They couldn't stay. But 15 children couldn't disappear into the desert. Not for long. She reached the spring, a meager trickle of water pooling in a rocky basin shaded by a stunted juniper. She knelt, dipping the bucket as the water gurgled in. Her eyes scanned the opposite bank, a habit born of solitude. Something caught her eye, a patch of damp earth near the base of the juniper, disturbed. Not by an animal, by a boot heel. Her breath caught. She set the bucket down silently and crept closer. There, pressed deep into the mud, was a clear boot print, large, deeply treaded. Not hers, not Jed's, and beside it, scratched hastily into the soft earth near the tree root with a stick or a knife point, was a crude but unmistakable mark. A C with a wavy line slashed through it. A snake. He'd been here. Last night, after the riders left, he'd found the spring. He'd left his mark. A message. A promise. Miriam Vance stood frozen, the cold dread washing over her anew, colder than the spring water. The hunters weren't just coming. They were already here, watching. The vast, empty desert suddenly felt like a cage, and her lonely cabin, a trap waiting to be sprung. She filled the bucket with trembling hands, the sloshing water sounding unnaturally loud in the silent dawn. The weight of 15 lives pressed down on her, heavier than the bloodroots themselves. She had to get them out. But where and how before the snake struck? The sloshing water in the bucket felt like a death knell echoing in the silent dawn. Miriam stood frozen by the spring, the crude snake-and-sea mark etched into the earth near the juniper root burning itself into her vision. The boot print beside it, large and deeply treaded, mocked a fragile sense of security she tried to build within the cabin walls. They were here, watching. The vastness of the alkali flats, once a familiar if harsh companion, now felt like an exposed plain offering no cover. Her cabin, her refuge for 20 years, was suddenly a beacon, a trap. She forced her trembling legs to move, hauling the heavy bucket back toward the cabin. Every rustle in the scrub, every shift of shadow cast by the rising sun, felt like a hidden watcher. The weight wasn't just the water. It was a crushing responsibility for 15 silent, terrified souls who depended on her brittle strength. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sleep and unwashed bodies. Most of the children were still huddled under thin blankets, though Jed was already at the door, his posture rigid, eyes darting nervously as she entered. Lena was coaxing the toddler, little Molly, to sip water from a tin cup. Both looked up instantly, their expressions mirroring Miriam's own dread before she could school her features. He was there, Miriam stated flatly, setting the bucket down with a thud that made several children stir. At the spring, left his mark, same as at Coyote, Washington. A collective gasp, quickly stifled, rippled through the older children. Jed's face paled further. Lena closed her eyes for a brief second, her hand tightening around the cup. Molly whimpered, sensing the tension. "We gotta go," Jed whispered, his voice cracking. "Now, Ms. Vance, before they come in daylight." "Go where, Jed?" Miriam asked, her voice low but firm. She scanned the cramped room, 15 pairs of wide, fearful eyes fixed on her. "Out there? Into the open? With the littles? How far do you reckon we'd get before horses caught us?" She saw the hopelessness settle on their faces. "No, we ford up, right here. Make him think twice about coming in easy." The word fort sparked a flicker of desperate purpose. Miriam moved with a speed that surprised even herself, driven by a primal protectiveness that overrode the gnawing fear. "Lena," Jed barred the shutters inside. "Use anything heavy. That old trunk in the corner. Slide it against the front window. Jed, check the back shutter latch. Make sure it's stout." She pointed to 2 older boys. "You too. Gather every pot, pan, tin cup. Pile them near the door. Noise might buy us a second if they try rushing." To the others, "Roll up the blankets tight. Stack them near the hearth. Clear the floor best you can." The cabin erupted into a flurry of hushed activity. The children moved with a grim efficiency born of terror, their fear channeled into action. Lena and Jed heaved a heavy, scarred trunk against the boarded front window. Others dragged stools, sacks of dwindling cornmeal. Even the rough-hewn table toward the door. The clatter of pots being gathered was unervingly loud. Miriam watched them, this ragtag army of the desperate, working together. It wasn't play, it was survival. The sight stirred something ancient within her, a memory of Silas showing her how to shore up a corral against a coming storm. Protect what's yours. As the children worked, Miriam pulled Lena aside near the cold hearth. The girl's face was drawn, dark smudges under her eyes like bruises. "Lena," Miriam said, keeping her voice low, "that mark, the snake and sea. Who are they? What do they want with you older ones? You said work. What kind of work needs burning camps and hunting children?" Lena flinched, her gaze dropping to the packed earth floor. She picked at a loose thread on her torn sleeve. They come at night," she whispered, her voice raw. "Like devils. Quiet at first, then fire. Shouting. They grabbed the big boys first. Jed, they tried for Jed." She swallowed hard. There was a man, tall, wore a hat pulled low, had a voice like gravel. He gave the orders. Said the Crimson Serpent needed strong backs. Said they paid good, but nobody wanted to go. Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. "They shot Mr. Henderson when he tried to stop M. Takin Billy. Just shot him." The Crimson Serpent. The name slithered through Miriam's mind, cold and venomous. A brand, a gang, a slaver outfit operating under the cover of the vast, indifferent desert. Strong backs meant mines, maybe railroads, brutal labor that broke men quickly, and they killed without hesitation. Jed's haunted look made sudden, terrible sense. "And the mark," Miriam pressed gently. The tall man, he burned it himself, on the wagon post. After, like claiming it. Lena shuddered violently, said it was a warning for anyone who hit us. A warning now left at Miriam Spring. The message was clear. "We know where you are. We're coming." The fortification continued. Miriam showed two girls how to wedge chair legs under the door latch for extra bracing. She demonstrated to a small group how to quickly pile the pots into a noisy barrier. Jed, his fears sharpening his senses, paced the perimeter of the single room, testing the shutters, peering through the tiniest cracks in the planks. The shared task, the focus on immediate survival, forged a fragile bond. Miriam saw hesitant glances turn towards her, not just with fear, but with a flicker of reliance. She saw Lena quietly directing the smaller children, her thin shoulders squared with a burdened authority. Miriam handed her a strip of jerky. "Eat that. Need your wits." Late afternoon brought a different kind of tension. The sun beat down, baking the cabin, turning the air inside thick and stale. The children grew listless, the initial adrenaline fading into exhaustion and simmering fear. Miriam was checking the back shutter for the 10th time when Jed hissed, "Rider!" coming slow from the south. Panic flared. Miriam peered through a knothole. A single figure on a tired-looking mule, trailing a string of pelts. Not the drifter, not the deputy. An old trapper named Eli Pike, known to occasionally wander the fringes near the bloodroots, trading furs in dry springs. He was harmless, mostly, but gossip traveled on the desert wind like dust. "Everyone quiet," Miriam ordered, her voice low and tight. Back from the windows. "Lena, keep Molly still." She unbarred the door just enough to step outside, closing it firmly behind her, blocking the view. Eli reined in his mule a respectful distance away. His face was a road map of wrinkles under a battered hat, his eyes pale and watery but sharp. "Mornin', Miss Vance," he drawled, touching his hat brim. His gaze swept over the cabin, lingering on the obviously barred shutters, the disturbed earth of the yard. "Seen the smoke. Figured I'd check. Unusual you having company?" He nodded toward the multitude of small footprints. Miriam kept her stance firm, blocking the door. Passing through, Eli, headed further west. Just gave M shelter for the night. Moving on soon. She kept her tone dismissive. Eli chewed thoughtfully on a piece of jerky. Passing through, huh? Lot of little feet for passing through. He spat. Heard some talk in Dry Springs yesterday. Deputy Barnes was stirring up a fuss. Said you was acting peculiar when they rode by. Then that slick fella he was with, the one with the restless eyes, he was asking questions, paying for drinks, loose-end tongues. Eli's gaze sharpened. A skim about a bunch of kids seen heading this way. Said there was money in it. Good money. For information. Or recovery. Miriam's blood ran cold. Bounty. The Crimson Serpent wasn't just hunting. They'd put a price on the children's heads. It explained the drifter's presence with the deputy. Scouting under a veneer of legitimacy. That's so. Miriam kept her voice level, though her knuckles were white on the doorframe behind her back. Ain't seen no bounty hunters, Eli. Just weary travelers. Like I said, moving on. Eli studied her for a long moment, his watery eyes missing nothing. The tension in her frame, the unnatural stillness of the cabin behind her. He sighed a dry, rasping sound. Well, just thought you ought to know, Miss Vance. Desert's got ears. And eyes. That slick fella, he was riding out early this morning. Headed north. Round the base of the Bloodroots. Didn't look like he was leaving for good. He nudged his mule. You take care now. Real careful. He touched his hat again and moved on, the mule plodding slowly, the pelts swaying like grim pendulums. Miriam watched him disappear into the shimmering heat haze. North, around the Bloodroots, not towards Dry Springs. Circling, positioning. Her cabin was the center of a tightening noose. She slipped back inside, rebarring the door, the heavy thud echoing the dread in her chest. 15 faces stared at her, waiting. Bounty, she stated, the word tasting like ash. They put a price on you. That drifter's still out there. Circling, a low murmur of fear ran through the children. Jed slammed his fist silently against the wall. Lena pulled Molly closer, her face grim. What do we do, Miss Vance? A small voice piped up from the huddle near the hearth. It was Thomas, maybe 7, his eyes huge in his grimy face. Miriam looked around at them. The gaunt faces, the bruised arms, the eyes that had seen too much horror for their years. They were Silas's ghost children, the family the desert had denied her, now delivered in terror. The hollow ache behind her ribs flared, not with emptiness, but with a fierce, burning defiance. She wouldn't let the serpent take them. We wait, she said, her voice rough but steady. We watch, and we make this place a thorn they won't want to pull. She picked up the heavy iron poker from a hearth. Jed, you take first watch at the front knothole. Lena, the back. Holler if you see anything. Rest of you, try to rest. Might be a long night. Dusk crept across the alkali flats, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The wind picked up, sighing around the cabin, finding the cracks to moan through. Inside, the air was thick with fear and the smell of unwashed bodies and cold beans. The meager supper Miriam had managed. The children huddled together, blankets pulled tight, most pretending to sleep. Jed and Lena remained rigid at their posts, eyes glued to their knotholes. The fading light outside turned the world into shifting, uncertain shapes. Miriam paced the small, clear space in the center of the room, the iron poker heavy in her hand. The harmonica in the drawer seemed to hum with silent tension. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set her nerves on edge. She stopped near the barricaded front window, peering over Jed's shoulder through the knothole he wasn't using. The vast expanse of scrubland stretched toward the darkening bulk of the Bloodroots. Nothing moved but the wind-stirred brush. Then Jed stiffened. He didn't make a sound, but the sudden tension in his thin frame was electric. Miriam followed his gaze, squinting into the gloom. There, near a cluster of boulders about 300 yards out, where the land began to rise towards the foothills. A shape, not a rock, too angular, too still. A man, sitting astride a horse, barely visible against the darkening landscape. He was just watching, a sentinel in the gathering dark. Even at that distance, Miriam could feel the predatory stillness of him, waiting, marking the cabin like a target. Jed finally breathed, a ragged, terrified whisper that cut through the suffocating silence of the room. He's back, the one from the spring. His voice cracked. He's just waiting. Miriam Vance felt the cold certainty of the trap snap shut. The hunter wasn't circling anymore. He was here. The crimson serpent had found its prey. The long, terrible night had just begun. The iron poker in her hand felt suddenly inadequate against the vast, watching darkness. The hunter didn't move. He was a dark, angular stain against the deepening twilight near the boulders, his horse a patient shadow beneath him. 300 yards of open scrubland stretched between him and the cabin. An impossible distance to cross silently, yet close enough to feel the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure against the barricaded shutters. Inside Miriam Vance's besieged world, the air thickened, tasting of dust, fear, and cold beans. The children's terrified silence was more suffocating than any wail. "He ain't leaving," Jed whispered, his eye pressed to the knothole, his voice taut as a bowstring. "No," Miriam agreed, her own voice raspy. The iron poker felt suddenly foolish, a child's toy against the implied violence radiating from that distant figure. The crimson serpent wasn't just circling, it had coiled. This lone rider was a herald. He wouldn't attack alone against a fortified position. He was waiting for reinforcements. Time, the desert's most indifferent currency, was now their most precious resource, draining away with every beat of her heart. "Lena," Miriam commanded, forcing her limbs to move, the need for action overriding paralyzing dread. "Check the back shutter again. Make sure the latch bar is seated deep. Jed, keep watch. Holler if he moves, or if you see anything else." She turned to the huddled mass of children, their wide eyes reflecting the dying embers in the hearth. "Rest of you, listen close. We need water. 1 bucket, quick as ghosts." "Who's fastest?" A wiry boy named Ben, maybe 11, raised a trembling hand. "Me, Ms. Vance. I'm quick." "Good. Ben, you and Sarah." She pointed to a sturdy girl of similar age. "You go. Bucket by the door. Straight to the spring. Fill it straight back. No look around, no stopping. You see anything, you drop the bucket and run. Scream. Understand?" Their solemn nods were grim. Miriam unbarred the door just enough for them to slip out, praying the watcher was too focused on the cabin itself to notice 2 small figures darting across the yard. The door thudded shut. The bar dropped back into place with finality. The minutes stretched, each one an eternity measured in frantic heartbeats. Miriam paced, the poker now a familiar, grounding weight. She stopped by the drawer where Silas's harmonica lay hidden. Its silent presence felt like an anchor, a whisper of the man who'd built these walls against the wilderness. "Protect what's yours," the memory echoed. Ben and Sarah slipped back inside, panting, the bucket sloshing. Relief washed over Miriam, quickly followed by a sharper fear. "See anything?" she demanded, barring the door. Ben shook his head, wide-eyed. "Nothing, Ms. Vance." But at the spring, he swallowed hard. There was something stuck in the juniper root, like it was put there. Miriam's blood chilled. "What?" "A knife," Sarah whispered. "Small, bone handle. Blade was curved like a snake." Miriam closed her eyes for a second. A calling card. A taunt. "We know you need water. We know you'll come." The serpent wasn't just patient. It was cruel. She distributed the water sparingly, the metallic taste of fear mixing with the tepid liquid. Dawn bled into the sky, a pale, washed-out gray offering no comfort. The rider was still there, a motionless sentinel. The children stirred, stiff and frightened. Miriam knew their meager supplies wouldn't last another day under siege. She needed information, a weakness, anything. She found Lena near the cold hearth, trying to coax Molly into eating a crumb of hardtack. The girl looked exhausted, her young face etched with lines of worry far too deep. "Lena," Miriam said quietly, kneeling beside her. "That tall man, the one who burned the mark. You said he tried to take Jed specifically?" Lena nodded, her eyes dark pools of remembered terror. "Yeah, Jed fought, bit one of them, got hit hard for it." She unconsciously touched a fading bruise on her own cheekbone. "The tall man," he grabbed Jed's arm, said he had the look they needed, said he'd fetch a good price, 'cause he was strong and wouldn't break easy. Her voice dropped. "He called Jed prime stocked." Miriam felt sick. Jed, maybe 12, thin as a rail, all angles and defiance. Prime stock. The dehumanization of it was chilling. Did he say anything else? About Jed? Or the serpent? Lena hesitated, glancing towards Jed, who was still glued to the knothole. He talked to another man. Said something. The boss wants the young bulls broken early. Pays extra for spirit. She shuddered. Then he saw me watching. Smiled, like it was funny. She looked down at Molly, smoothing her hair. "Jed's my brother, Ms. Vance. I couldn't let him take him. That's why we ran. All of us ran together." The revelation landed heavily. Jed and Lena were siblings. This wasn't just a random grab for labor. Jed had been singled out. His spirit marked him as valuable, making him a specific target. The danger wasn't just collective. It was intensely personal for Lena and now, by extension, for Miriam. The morning wore on, the sun climbing, baking the cabin into an oven. The rider remained. Desperation gnawed at Miriam. She needed eyes beyond the knothole, a sense of the wider threat. Risking a quick peek herself, she scanned the horizon. Nothing but heat haze and scrub. Then, movement from the south, not riders, but a single, familiar wagon rattling slowly towards them. Bess Gable's supply wagon from Dry Springs. Miriam's mind raced. Bess was sharp-tongued but not unkind. She brought supplies monthly, a rare, grudgingly tolerated intrusion into Miriam's solitude. Now, she was a potential lifeline or a herald of doom. Could she be trusted? Had the bounty poisoned Dry Springs? Jed, Lena, away from the windows. Miriam ordered. Everyone quiet. Deep quiet. She waited until the wagon drew nearer, then unbarred the door and stepped out, closing it firmly behind her, the poker held loosely but visibly at her side. Bess Gable reined in her old mule Dusty, her broad face flushed from the heat beneath a faded sunbonnet. Her sharp eyes took in the barred shutters, the disturbed yard, Miriam's tense posture, the poker. Her usual brusque greeting died on her lips. "Miriam Vance," she stated, her voice laced with uncharacteristic caution. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or made one." Her gaze flickered towards the boulders. "That fella been sitting there long? You know him?" Miriam countered, her voice tight. Bess spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the hard-packed earth. "Know of him. Name's Cade. Rides with mean bunch. Seen him drinking with that slick-talking drifter who was a skin questions yesterday. Stirring up trouble." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "There's talk, Miriam. Ugly talk. Posters went up late last night. Offered by some outfit count, itself the Crimson Serpent. Good money for information lead into the recovery of property." She stressed a word with disgust. Said, "Stray children from a recent disturbance. $5 a head." Bess's eyes held Miriam's, fierce and knowing. $5 makes even decent folk see crooked Miriam. And Dry Springs ain't exactly brimmin' with decent folk these days. Deputy Barnes, he's looking the other way. Seems like got a new pocket watch shiny. Miriam's knuckles whiten on the poker. $5 a head. $75 for 15 children. A fortune in this hardscrabble land. It explained Cade's patience. He wasn't just waiting for reinforcements. He was waiting for greed to flush them out or for desperation to force their hand. Dry Springs was no longer just indifferent. It was potentially hostile. "Brought your usual," Bess said, gesturing to the back of the wagon. "Sacks of flour, beans, a small side of bacon. Figured you might need it more than usual." She paused, her gaze softening slightly. "Heard about the camp at Coyote, Washington nasty business. Kids didn't deserve that." She looked pointedly at the closed cabin door. "You got your hands full, woman." "I do, Bess," Miriam admitted, the simple acknowledgement heavy. "I thank you for supplies." "And the warning." Bess nodded curtly. "Don't thank me. Just be smart and be careful. That Cade fella ain't sitting out there for his health. Heard him brag Jen last night about how the serpent always gets its prey. Said they had a special buyer lined up for a feisty one." She gathered the reins. "You need more than that poker, Miriam Vance." With a final, meaningful look, she clucked to Dusty, and the wagon creaked away, leaving Miriam alone under the vast, watchful sky, the supplies a mocking testament to a life that no longer existed. Miriam hauled the precious supplies inside, the bacon and flour feeling like stolen treasure. She barred the door, the children watching her every move. "Dry Springs knows," she said flatly. "There's a bounty, $5 a head." A collective gasp. Jed slammed his fist against the wall again, a silent scream of fury. "And Cade out there," Miriam continued, pointing toward the boulders. "He's waiting for us to get desperate, or for more of his kind." She looked at Jed, Lena's words echoing. "Prime stock. Feisty one. Seems he has a particular interest, Jed." Jed flinched, his young face hardening into a mask of defiance mixed with terror. "Let him try," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Miriam knew waiting was suicide. They needed an edge. Her gaze fell on the corner where Silas's old Sharps rifle leaned and used for 20 years. Coated in dust, but likely still functional. A desperate plan began to form. She couldn't fight them all, but maybe she could scare them by time, create an opening. "Lena," Miriam said, her voice low and urgent. "Come here." She walked to the corner and picked up the heavy rifle. The dust motes danced in the shaft of light from a crack in the shutter. "You ever fired a gun?" Lena shook her head, eyes wide. "Time you learned." Miriam's heart hammered, trusting a child with this. But Lena had the steady eyes, the fierce protectiveness. "This is a Sharps. Kicks like a mule. Only point it if you mean to use it. Only pull the trigger if you have to. Understand?" Lena swallowed, then nodded, her gaze fixed on the long barrel. "Yes, ma'am." They cleared a small space near the back wall, furthest in the front where Cade watched. Miriam showed Lena how to hold the heavy stock, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger slow and steady. "It's for the door," Miriam explained grimly. "If they try to rush it, you aim center mass. You don't hesitate." Lena's hands trembled slightly, but her jaw was set. The responsibility etched new lines on her young face. Miriam saw Silas in the way Lena squinted down the sights, a ghost of the man who taught her on this very rifle long ago. "Protect what's yours." As dust began to paint the sky once more, the tension inside the cabin was a live wire. Lena sat near the back, the Sharps across her knees, a terrifying new weight. Jed remained at the front knothole, his vigil unbroken. Miriam paced, the poker now a secondary comfort. She checked the back shutter one last time, peering through a crack into the gathering gloom of the yard. Her garden plot was a sad patch of struggling green in the vast dun expanse. Then she saw it, near the edge of the mesquite fence, half hidden by a withered squash vine. Not a knife this time. Something small, pale. A bone, deliberately placed. A chicken bone, picked clean. And beside it, scratched into dirt, the now familiar, chilling mark, the sea with the serpent slashed through it. They hadn't just watched. They'd come close, very close, slipped right up to her garden fence in the fading light, left their mark like predators marking territory. A silent message: your walls are nothing. We come and go as we please. Miriam stumbled back on the shutter, cold terror washing over her. They were playing with her, with them, demonstrating their power, their inevitability. She turned, the words of warning freezing on her lips as Jed let out a choked, strangled gasp from the front knothole. He wasn't looking at Kate anymore. He was staring, rigid with terror, further south, down the trail Bess Gable had taken hours before. His voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper filled with a dread deeper than anything before. More riders, Miss Vance, coming fast. 6 of them, led by him, the tall man. Jed's whisper, raw with terror, hung in the air like in smoke. More riders, Miss Vance, coming fast. 6 of them, led by him, the tall man. Miriam Vance felt the earth tilt beneath her. The bone in the garden, the watching sentinel cade, the bounty posters poisoning dry springs. It had all been tightening the noose. Now the executioner rode at its head. 6 men, against 1 worn-out woman, 15 terrified children, and a Sharps rifle held by a girl who'd never fired a gun until today. She shoved past Jed to the knothole. Dust plumed on the southern trail, resolving into shapes. 6 horsemen riding hard, eating the distance. In the lead, unmistakable even at a gallop, was a tall figure, hat pulled low, riding with predatory ease. Silas Crow, the man who burned brands and called children prime stock, the embodiment of the Crimson Serpent. Panic threatened to choke her. The cabin, their fragile fortress, suddenly felt like a coffin. Lena sat rigid by the back wall, the Sharps impossibly heavy across her thin knees, her face pale but set. The other children huddled together, a mass of wide eyes and trembling limbs. Molly buried her face in Lena's skirt, silent sobs shaking her small frame. Right, Miriam rasped, the words scraping her throat. She forced steel into her voice, the same steel she'd used to face 20 years of desert solitude, now forged anew in desperation. Positions: Jed, front knothole. Lena, you know your place. Ben, Sarah, pots ready by the door. The rest of you, down flat, cover your heads. Her commands cut through the paralyzing fear, sparking frantic movement. Children scrambled, flattening themselves near the hearth. Ben and Sarah positioned themselves behind the precarious mountain of pots and pans near the door, ready to shove. Miriam grabbed the iron poker, its familiar weight a small anchor. She positioned herself beside the barricaded front window, peering through a gap beside the trunk. The riders were close now, pulling up in a cloud of dust just beyond the range of easy pistol shot, fanning out slightly. Crow sat his horse at the center, flanked by Cade and 4 others, hard-faced men with the dead eyes of hired muscle. Crow nudged his horse a few steps forward. His voice, when it came, was exactly as Lena had described, gravel scraping on stone, loud in the sudden, watchful silence. "Miss Vance," he called, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy. "Understand you've got some misplaced property holed up in there. Property belonging to the Crimson Serpent." Miriam pushed open the shutter a crack, just enough to be heard. "Ain't no property here, mister. Just children seeking shelter. You're trespassing." Crow chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Shelter? From what? Us? We're just here to collect what's owed. Had a deal with our caretaker at Coyote, Washington, paid good money for a consignment of strong backs." Then these ungrateful whelps lit out. He leaned forward in his saddle, his gaze seeming to pierce the flimsy wood. "Specifically, we're missing one. Feisty little bull named Jed. Boss is a special buyer lined up who appreciates spirit, pays a premium for it being broken just right." His eyes scanned the shuttered windows. "Hand him over, Miss Vance, and maybe we let the rest scatter. Keep your cabin intact." "Refuse!" He let the threat hang, punctuated by the deliberate cocking of a rifle by one of his men. Miriam's blood ran cold. A special buyer for spirit. The monstrousness of it, the casual commodification of a child's defiance, ignited a fury that burned hotter than fear. She thought of Silas, not in grief, but in the way he'd stood firm against a claimed jumper years ago, the same sharps now in Lena's hands leveled and steady. Protect what's yours. These children, hunted and terrified, were hers now. Her legacy, forged not in her womb, but in shared fear and defiance. You ain't talking anyone, Miriam shouted back, her voice ringing clear and hard across the yard. This is my land. These children are under my roof. You want em, you come through me and this iron. She banged the poker against the shutter frame for emphasis. Crow's mocking smile vanished, replaced by cold irritation. Stupid woman. You got sand, I'll give you that. But sand don't stop lead. He raised a hand. Cade, deal with the door. Cade dismounted, drawing a heavy pistol and a wicked-looking knife. He started towards the cabin, moving with the confident swagger of a man who'd done this before. The other riders raised their rifles, covering him. Ben, Sarah, get ready, Miriam hissed. Inside, the tension was a physical force. Jed whimpered at the knothole. Lena shifted the sharps, her knuckles white on the stock, her eyes squinting down the long barrel toward the back wall, waiting for the inevitable attempt to flank. Cade reached the door. He didn't bother knocking. He slammed his boot hard against the wood near the latch. The door shuddered, the bar groaning, the wedge share leg scraping. He kicked again. A plank near the latch splintered. Now! Miriam yelled. Ben and Sarah shoved with all their might. The teetering pile of pots, pans, and tin cups crashed down behind the door with an ear-splitting, discordant clatter. Cade, startled by the sudden cacophony right behind the wood, stumbled back a step, cursing. At the same moment, a heavy thud sounded at the back shutter. They were trying to flank. Lena gasped, swinging the heavy sharps toward the sound. Miriam saw the fear in her eyes, the tremor in her hands. Steady, girl, Miriam commanded, her own gaze darting between the front and Lena. Aim true, only if you see him. Another kick at the front door. More splintering. Cade was braced now, ignoring the noise, kicking methodically. The bar wouldn't hold much longer. Outside, Crow watched impassive. Thud. Crack. The sound came from the back. Not a kick. An axe blade biting into the shutter wood. Lena flinched, the rifle barrel wavering. Lena, Miriam shouted. They're coming through. Hold your ground. Lena took a shuddering breath. She planted her feet, settled the stock tight against her bony shoulder, and sighted down the barrel at the shuddering back shutter panel. Miriam saw the ghost of Silas in her stance, the grim determination, the acceptance of the terrible task. Crunch. A section of the back shutter near the latch exploded inward as an axe head burst through. A man's face, leering and brutal, appeared in the gap, framed by splintered wood. He was reaching through to lift the latch bar. Lena didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The roar inside the small cabin was deafening. Flame spat from the barrel. The heavy stock slammed back into Lena's shoulder, knocking her off her feet. The world seemed to hold its breath. Outside, a scream tore through the air, not from the back, but from the side of the cabin. The man who'd been chopping at the back shutter reeled backwards, clutching his upper arm, blood blossoming dark on his sleeve. Lena's shot, fired in the confined space at a moving target through splintered wood, had gone wide of the face in the gap, but found flesh. The effect was electric. Kay at the front door froze mid-kick, shocked by the rifle blast from inside. The leering face at the back vanished with a yelp. The covering riders jerked their horses, startled by the scream and the unexpected resistance. For a crucial second, confusion reigned. Crow's face contorted with rage. "You bitch!" he roared at the cabin. "You'll pay for that." He raised his rifle, aiming not at the shutters, but high, at the roof. He fired. The bullet tore through the sun-baked sod, sending a shower of dirt and debris inside near the hearth. Children screamed, covering their heads. Before Crow could fire again, a new sound cut through the chaos, the rhythmic thud of galloping hooves approaching fast in the direction of Dry Springs. Not more serpent men. One rider bent low, urging a horse on mercilessly. Bess Gable. Bess reined in hard, her wagon mule lathered and blowing, stopping between the cabin and the serpent riders. She didn't have a rifle, but she stood tall in her stirrups, her face furious. "Crow," she bellowed, her voice carrying across the sudden stillness. "You and your vermin clear off. Ain't you done enough damage? Dry Springs might look the other way for silver, but some folks got eyes. Sheriff's been roused. He's mustering a posse right now. You want to be here when they come." Crow's eyes darted from the bleeding man clutching his arm to the defiant cabin to Bess's furious stance and back towards Dry Springs. The calculation was swift. A wounded man, unexpected resistance, the threat of a posse, even a slow-moving one, tipped the scales away from a guaranteed victory. His special buyer wasn't worth a shootout with a town, however corruptible. He spat into the dust. "This ain't over, widow," he snarled toward the cabin. "The serpent always finds his prey. We'll be back for the boy, and you'll pay dearly." He gestured sharply. "Mount up. Kate, see to Harker." He fixed Miriam with one last venomous glare, then wheeled his horse. The riders gathered their wounded comrade and spurred away, kicking up a plume of dust that hung in the late afternoon air like a dirty banner. Silence descended, broken only by Dusty's labored breathing and the soft whimpering of terrified children inside the cabin. Bess dismounted, her hand shaking slightly as she tied the mule. Miriam unbarred the shattered front door, stepping out onto the step, the poker still in her hand. She fell hollowed out, trembling with spent adrenaline. "Bess," Miriam began, her voice rough. "Save it." Bess cut her off, striding forward. She peered past Miriam into the dim interior, taking the frightened faces, the overturned pots, the splintered back shutter, Lena sitting dazed on the floor beside the still-smoking sharps. "Lord above," she muttered. She looked back at Miriam, her gaze sharp but lacking its usual bite. "Told you needed more than a poker. Sheriff might stir eventually, if enough decent folk kick up a fuss." But Crow meant what he said. They'll be back, especially for that boy. She nodded towards Jed, who was peering out, his face a mask of terrified defiance. Miriam knew it. The victory was fragile, bought with a warning shot and Bess's bluff. The crimson serpent's shadow still stretched long over the alkali flats. She looked at the children, bruised, exhausted, but alive. Her children. Silas's harmonica seemed to hum silently in the drawer, not with sorrow now, but with fragile, defiant harmony. "Let him come back," Miriam said, her voice gaining strength as she looked at Lena picking herself up, at Jed standing protectively near his sister, at little Molly reaching out her arms. "This is their home now. We'll be ready." The next days were spent repairing. The shattered door plank was replaced with thicker, which scrounged from an old storage shed. The back shutter was reinforced with heavy crossbars. The scar from the bullet in the roof remained, a stark reminder. Miriam showed Jed how to spot tracks, how to move quietly in the scrub. Lena practiced loading the sharps with grim determination. The children tended the garden with renewed purpose. Their laughter, hesitant at first, now a frequent sound weaving to the desert wind. One evening, as Miriam sat mending a torn shirt under the fading light, Lena joined her. The girl traced a finger over a faded ink stain on the fabric. "This was Pa's," she said softly, her voice thick. Jed spilled ink all over it once. Ma was furious, but Pa just laughed, said it gave it character. She looked up at Miriam, her eyes reflecting the last of the sun. "They're gone, taken by a fever 2 winters back. That's why we was at Coyote, Washington." Miriam nodded, the simple story a key unlocking a deeper understanding of the girl's fierce protectiveness. She placed a callous hand over Lena's. No words were needed. The shared silence spoke of loss, of resilience, of a family found in the crucible of fear. Weeks turned into months. Dry springs remained wary, a mix of pity and suspicion. Bess brought supplies and news. Whispers of the Crimson Serpent still operating, but further east. No sign of Crow near the Bloodroots. Yet, the threat lingered, a serpent coiled just beyond the horizon. Miriam Vance stood on her porch, watching the sun sink behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in fiery hues. The desert wind, no longer just a mourner's cry, carried the sound of children playing a cautious game near the garden. Jed leading, Lena watching protectively, Molly toddling after them. The harmonica's weight was a comfort in her pocket now, a bridge between the silent years and this noisy, demanding, utterly precious present. The cabin bore its scars, inside and out. Her hands were rougher, her heart fuller, the hollow ache replaced by a fierce, protective warmth. The Crimson Serpent might still writhe in the shadows, but here, beneath the vast, watchful sky, a different kind of strength had taken root. She wasn't just enduring the desert anymore. She was defending her home, her family, and the desert in a harsh, unforgiving way had finally given her a reason to truly live. She touched the harmonica, a silent promise carried on the wind to Silas and to the children who had mended her broken world. They were home, for now, and for as long as she could stand against the gathering dark.